All right, Jabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tavshin Pei Hey, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all B'Shem Drashos and the Schos of Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan. Ha'ba'alin L'Tova. Paul Pollack, in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, his granddaughter Tikva Esther, and the birth of his grandson to Eden Jeremiah Pollack. An anonymous Talmud Torah sponsorship in the Schos of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for all of Klal Yisrael. Avram and Shane Dikelm, in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel, Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those in the Refuah Shtav and Kedah, Kol Chol Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu Shnei Hashem, bring our hostages home, B'Shalom and B'Karav, and our holy soldiers should be successful. B'Chol Ma'asei Yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Tes Vav 15. We are picking up on Yud Daled Amud Beis 14b, 10 lines up from the bottom, the Itmar. So if you remember again, we are in the midst of dealing with, we're actually coming off of the Sugya. We're actually in the middle, we're in the middle of the Mishnah, or the middle of the segment of the Mishnah, speaking about the concept of Makkos for Chayve Krisos. So the Gemara says as follows, I'm talking about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the Itmar. We actually began this case in the waning moments of yesterday's shir. If a person who's tameh ate sacrificial meat before zrika, before the sprinkling of the blood. Remember again, normally you'd go ahead and you'd have zrika done as part of the matir, as part of what permits sacrificial meat. So let's say sacrificial meat was consumed before zrika. So what is the halacha over here? So the Gemara says as follows: Reish Lakish says you get malchus. Now obviously we're talking about someone who's tameh. So if he's tameh and he's consuming sacrificial meat, he's going to be chayiv. He's chayiv. The interesting shaila is: is there a chiyuv before zrika or not? So Reish Lakish says yes, you get malchus. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get malchus. So what's going on over here? So Reish Lakish says you get malchus b'chol kodesh lo siga. Torah says that if you're tameh, you're not allowed to touch any kodesh. Lo shna lifnei zrika, lo shna la'achar zrika. Makes no difference before zrika, after zrika. Someone who's tameh is not allowed to come in contact with kodesh. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ino loka." Why? Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get malchus. Why not? The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan tameh. The Amar Kra tumaso. V'chi ksiv tumaso la'achar zrika hu dichsiv. Because the say when the Torah discusses, when the Torah utilizes the phrase tumaso of his tumah is upon him, and talks about the prohibition of coming in contact with kodesh, the context of that is after zrika. Interesting. Okay, so the Gemara says, Hahu mi b'chol kodesh nafka. Now the Gemara says, 1 second. Now this idea of the Isser of Basar Kodesh before Zrika's dam should come mi b'chol kodesh. Tanya kavasi Reish Lakish. Ultimately, a right stands supports Reish Lakish. B'chol kodesh lo siga. The Torah says, do not touch any kodesh. As hara la'ochel. This is actually a law, a prohibition, prohibiting the consumption of kodesh while in a state of tumah. Now, what's interesting about that is, again, it's phrased as b'chol kodesh lo siga. Don't touch. Yet the Gemara is saying over here that it is actually a prohibition to consume kachim while in a state of tumah. So you're saying, so you're telling me now that it's a lav for consumption, maybe not. Maybe it's only a lav for actual physical contact, telling you that when one is tameh, you can't have physical contact with kodesh. Talmud lomar b'chol kodesh lo siga vela mikdash lo yavo. Makish kodesh lo mikdash. Supposed to say here. So here's what's interesting. In that same pasuk, it says, "Do not touch kodesh and do not come into the mikdash in a state of ritual impurity." The Gemara says it makes a comparison between kodesh, which is the sacrificial item or the consecrated item, and the mikdash. How so? Ma mikdash davar sheyish bo netilas neshama. Just as when it comes to the mikdash, we're talking about a prohibition that if transgressed would result in a death penalty. I mean, in this case, it's kares. So, right, because if you enter into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah, ultimately, again, that is a chiyuv kares. Af kol davar sheish bo netilas neshama. So too, when it says b'chol kodesh lo siga. It's also just like v'lamikdash lo yavo is talking about something which, if transgressed, is a chi of kares. So therefore, talking about entering into the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash while in a state of ritual impurity. So too the Gemara says the first part of the pasuk, b'chol kodesh lo siga, must also be talking about something which, if transgressed, would result in a chi of kares. Now, what is that? The ibenigia mi ikinatilas shama ela ba'achila. Now, here's what's interesting. As much as one who is tamei is not permitted to go ahead and touch something that is kodesh, what happens if he does so? What happens if he do so? It's not a chi of kares, right? It's lav. It's a lav. So therefore, again, it can't be talking about negia. It must be talking about achila, consumption. So most it's actually a very interesting drasha, because the truth is, it's not intuitively the way we've ever read the pasuk. Ela mikdash lo yavo, or b'chol kodesh lo siga, ve'ela mikdash lo yavo. So up until this Gemara, we always thought that pasuk meant as follows: do not touch any kodesh item if you are tamei, and do not enter into the Beis Hamikdash if you are in a state of tumah. So now the Gemara says, now Reish Lakish says, that can't be the meaning of the pasuk. Because again, working backwards, B'chol ve'ela mikdash lo yavo is talking about something which carries with it a chi of kares. If you enter into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah, that is a chi of kares. Therefore, it only makes sense that the first part of the pasuk is also talking about a chi of kares. Well, if it's pashat pshat, that is talking about touching a consecrated item while you're tamei, although that is usher, that doesn't result in a chi of kares. Therefore, it must be b'chol kodesh lo siga is actually talking about consumption. Okay, incredible. So ma mikdash davar sheish bo netilas hashama. So just like entering into the mikdash in a state of tumah, something that carries with the penalty of kares. Af kol davar sheish bo netilas hashama v'benegia. And if the pasuk pshat of the pasuk is talking about a tamei person touching kodesh, mi'ika netilas neshama, is there a chi of kares for touching kodesh? No, ela ba'achila. It must be talking about consumption. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, fine, that's the end of that. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, this is actually quite interesting. Listen to this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, pay attention to this. Pay attention to everything. But I'm saying, pay specific attention to this, because this concept is actually going to be something that's going to frame pretty much the rest of the daf. Rabbi Yochanan. What does Rabbi Yochanan say? Kol lo saseh shekadmu aseh lokin alav. Okay, so we'll say, so remember again, in general, what are you getting, if we're compiling our list, what are you getting Makkos for so far, right? What have we learned? What are you getting Makkos for? Number one, a lav, right? General lav. Yit chazer. You wear shatnez, right? You go out and you soak kilayim, right? Basic lavim. Basic lavim. Good. What else? Number two? I'm sorry? Good. Hold on to that, the technicalities. I just mean general categories, right? Lav. What else? Rabbi Akiva. Yes, sir. Good. Chiv kares. Good. Excellent. Right? Chiv kares. Chavi krisos, right? Chavi krisos, right? And general lavin. In the world of lavin, as Kama Kiva just mentioned, then again, we're going to get more into specific, we'll get to it in just a moment. But those are general categories. What are you not getting Makkos for? Number one, misos bezdin. Good. And number two, the big one, although it was just mentioned kind of tangentially, was asay. And number three, lav hanitak la'asay. Lav hanitak la'asay means, it's fun when daf is interactive. All right, we'll start it off. Right, so again, lav hanitak la'asay. Lav hanitak la'asay means a lav that is remedied by the performance of a positive commandment. Classic example of that, Geneva, excellent. Theft, right? You steal something, the Torah says v'hishav ha'gazela. So whenever you have a lav that is immediately or can be immediately remedied by, and I say generally, the general understanding is there's no Makkos for that. Okay, now on that, Rabbi Yochanan comes along and advances something fascinating. He says, bless you, Kol lo saseh shekadmo aseh. What happens if you have a lav that is preceded by an aseh? So an lav preceded by an aseh. So take a look at Rashi. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Lokin alav. That you get Makkos for. Okay, let's dig into the last, this is very exciting. Let's dig into the last Rashi of the daf. Last Rashi in Amud Beis. So Kol lo saseh shekadmo aseh, Lokin alav. Listen to this. Ha asalash meinon. So remember again, well, even according to the opinion I just mentioned before, that a lav hanita klase, so a prohibition, a lav that is remedied by the performance of a positive commandment, kidisanya, lo sosiru, V'hanos sartisrofu. Oh, Karban Pesach. Karban Pesach. Right, there's another paradigmatic example. That I will say, it's incredible, by the way. Third day, right? Third day since Wednesday. Right? Third day since Pesach. We'll say there has been a Pesach reference on the daf every single day. And there's another one still later on today. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. It shows that Baruch Hashem, Klal Yisrael had a beautiful Pesach. Because when you have a beautiful, the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says that the bracha that we say in Yishtabach, Habocher b'shirei zimra. Habocher b'shirei zimra. So the Rebbe says you could vocalize that in a different way. Habocher b'shiyarei zimra. What does the Ribono Shel Olam like more than anything? So human beings don't like leftovers, right? After a certain point in time, we don't eat leftovers. The Ribono Shel Olam loves leftovers. Shirayim. He loves leftovers. What he loves more than anything is that when we have a spiritual experience and we are able to take leftovers with us, we're able to take shirayim, just like Hasidim get shirayim, they get leftovers of the Rebbe. Every single spiritual experience is supposed to yield shirayim. It's supposed to yield leftovers. And those leftovers are what sustain you as you go forward. Habocher b'shiyarei zimra. The Moshe loves shirayim. He loves leftover. And it's incredible, the fact that we keep on having a Pesach reference every single day after Yom Tiv is mamish the shirayim from what must have been, if this is what's happening for Klal Yisrael on the daf, it must have been a Heilige Yom Tov, that again we get to take shirayim with us every single day. Kidisanyo, loso siruvano, sertisrofu. So again, Karban Pesach is a perfect example. There's a prohibition, right? There's a prohibition. Don't leave over. And if you do, burn whatever is left over. So that's called a lav hanitak la'aseh. Okay, so everyone, we'll call it right now, everyone, is agreeing that halacha l'maaseh, don't get malchus for that. All right, so the Gemara says, Baha kasov litain aseh, acher lo saseh, lo marshin lokin alav, shenita kakosov es haseh, lios onshol shalav vitikuno, lomar lo saseh kach. So we'll say, because how does a lav nitak la'aseh work? The lav says, don't do this. Don't do this. Don't leave over Karban Pesach. And then what does the Torah do? V'masisa, but if you left it over, aseh zos v'hipater. Ultimately, again, do this. What's the this? What's the this? What's the this? The aseh. Do the aseh and clean up your mess. Clean up your mess. So good. So I'll say, by the way, just you should also understand, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in a lav hanitak la'aseh. Just like on a ruchni level, lav hanitak la'aseh is the way the Ribono Shel Olam communicates to us one of the most important yisodos in life. If you make a mess, clean it up, right? It's the yisod that we try to teach our children from the time that they have some level of cognition and can understand the sense of achrayus. And so Kadosh Baruch Hu teaches us in life. Don't do this. Don't do this. But if you do it, so say, after I commit an avera, there's a tremendous yetzer hara. What's the yetzer hara after you commit? It's interesting. People don't think about a yetzer hara after you commit an avera. They think about the yetzer hara before you commit the avera. What's the yetzer hara after I commit the avera? What's the yetzer hara? Yeyosh. Oh, I made such a mess. Look what I did. Oy vavoy, woe for me. And just wallow in it. What is love? What's the hashkaf of lav hanitak la'aseh? You made a mess. Okay, that's unfortunate. Now what? Clean it up. You made a mess. Now clean it up. That's not just the halach of lav hanitak la'aseh, but the hashkafa. Okay, so now that's lav hanitak la'aseh. Rabbi Yochanan, listen to Rashi. Last two lines of Rashi. Vashvin Rabbi Yochanan. Now Rabbi Yochanan comes along and he says as follows: Hani mili ba'aseh haba achar halav. Now this is fascinating. Alav hanitak la'aseh rabosai. So the lav comes first. Lo sosiru mimenu ad boker. Do not leave over from the Karban Pesach until morning. And then there's an aseh. Vanoser mimenu ad boker ba'esh tisaref. Right, ba'esh tisrofu. Then there's the aseh afterwards. Rabbi Yochanan says there's another model also. Where what? He says, and again, remember in general, the way alav hanitak la'aseh works is you could only perform the aseh when? After you've violated the lav. So you could only burn the leftover Karban Pesach after you left it over. You could only return the stolen object after you committed an act of theft. This is fascinating. Aval, aseh shekadam es halav. Let's say you have an aseh. That's before the lav. Now we'll see an example of this. We have an aseh before the lav, and you could perform this aseh even before you perform the lav. Obviously, the Gemara says, "Kol avaras halav ein zen nitak halav, vafilu tekaimenu achar averas halav lo nifteres min Makkos. Okay, so watch this. So Rabbi Yochanan says like, very exciting. Rabbi Yochanan says like this. Rabbi Yochanan says like this. Yes, I'm overcompensating for my statement yesterday, right? And so I'll say, so again, so now, very, very exciting. So listen to this. So now on one hand, we have lav anita klase, just because remember these constructs, because the truth is they're also going to be very helpful for us for the rest of the Masechta, and then Shavuos as well. So again, so I have a lav anita klase. So there's a lav prohibition. If you violate the prohibition, you can remedy it with an asay. Let's call it for now. Everyone's agreeing, no malchus on that. In that case, the only way to get to the asay is through the performance of the losa asay. Rabbi Yochanan now advances a different model. He's not advancing. He said there's another biblical model. The other biblical model is an asay that comes before a lav, which we're going to see means the following. That you could perform the asay before the lav, but you could also perform the asay as a repair module after the lav. Rabbi Yochanan says, in that case, you do get malchus. You do get malchus. Now again, it'll make a bit more sense once we kind of put an example on this, but this is what's called an asay. An asay, ultimately again, or a los asay shekidnu asay. Fine. So Rabbi Yochanan, you get malchus on that. Top of Tezvav, this is great. Amar lo, amart. So apparently this conversation came up, and they said some other people who heard this name of Rabbi Yochanan but didn't hear from Rabbi Yochanan themselves. Rabbi Yochanan, did you say that? Amar lahu lo amar. He's like, nope, never said that. Never said that. Rabba says, Helakim Amra. Rabbi Yochanan, what are you talking about? I was there. You said it. You definitely said it. Uksiva v'tanina. And by the way, it's actually, you're right. You're right. In other words, this construct is actually found in a pasuk, and it's also found in a brayso. Listen to this. Vaishalchu min hamachane. So this is very supposed to. Here it is. Vaishalchu min hamachane. The Torah says, you shall send away from the camp anyone who is ritually pure, right? Savis b'nei Yisrael, v'yishalchu min hamachane, kol tzarua, v'chol zav, v'chol tamei lanefesh. So anyone, again, who is ritually impure, a zav, tzaras, tamei, tuma, tumas meis, you have to send them out of the camp. So in the desert, right? And in Eretz Yisrael as well, outside of certain areas of Yerushalayim. So you have to send them out of the camp, okay? Then it says, what happens? V'yishalchu min hamachane, v'lo yitamu es machanehem. And ultimately, again, then it says, do not defile your camp. So if you notice it, so the Gemara says, Tanina haba lemikdash tameh. So this is talking about ultimately someone who comes to the mikdash in a state of tumah. So look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, so ksiva v'tanina, Rashi says, so matzinu kasov lo sase shekadmu aseh, v'tanina alei delokin v'lo sagile b'kim aseh. Tanina haba lemikdash tameh. Kachashav lebe Elohein alokin. So it says here's something very interesting, right? So you have over here, Vaishalchu min hamachane. That's an asay. That's an asay, right? And then ultimately, again, I have a los asay, which is ala mikdash losa, right? Then I have a los asay. So what do you see from here? Halacha lemaisa. And if you violate the asay, and if you violate the lav, and you come into the mikdash in a state of tumah, what's the halacha? You get malchus. You get malchus. Now, both saying, now think about this for just a moment, right? Actually going ahead and entering into the mikdash in a state of tumah, technically speaking, why don't you call that a lav hanita klase? It's prohibited, but you could exit. Right? So what's interesting, and yet we just said, remember again, this is in our list in the Mishnah. If you come into the mikdash in a state of tumah, halacha l'maisa, you get malchus. Now granted, you get kares also, but you get malchus. So why do you get malchus for this? Because here there's an asay. Vayishalchu min hamachana. That's the asay. Then there's a lav afterwards. This is Rabbi Yochanan, that kol lo saseh shekidmu asay lokin alav. So Rabbi is saying to Rabbi Yochanan, why are you recanting? You're right. So Elam my time akahadrabe. So why did Rabbi Yochanan recant? So the Gemara said, listen to this. Mishum dekashele ones. Because he was bothered by the following case. He was bothered by the case of ones. Case of ones is the case of a man who violates a woman. Now, in the event that a man violates a woman, there's a number of different penalties involved. One of them is that he is obligated to marry her, assuming she wants to get married to him. That he has to marry her, and he is not allowed to divorce her forever. Okay, so now watch this. Tisanya. Ones shegiresh. So we'll say, now what happens? So now let's say Reuven violates Rachel, right? Now he has to marry her, in addition to other penalties which we'll discuss. Reuven has, so first I'll take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Mishum dekashle ones. Now Rabbi Shmuel da'ashkechon be'lo saseh shekadmu aseh. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. Here's an example of an aseh that preceded a lo saseh. What's the aseh? V'lo sia le'isha. First thing the Torah says is, Reuven, if you violate Rachel, she has to be your wife. You have to marry her. That's the asay. Afterwards it says, lo yuchal l'sholcha. Then it says, by the way, you're not allowed to divorce her. So the asay comes first, right? So what's fascinating is before Rabbi Yochanan made this statement, I would have thought, what is that called? What is this called? I would have thought it's called just alav hanitak la'aseh. Now what we're understanding is, no, alav hanitak la'aseh ultimately, again, really is where, first of all, the lav is mentioned, the asay is mentioned after the lav. You have this another category of an asay that comes before the lav. So again, the Torah says, number one, asay, you have to marry her. Number two, lo saseh, you can't divorce her. Lo yuchal l'shalcha, v'tanya Allah she'ekayim es asay im girsha v'yachzirena v'yiftar, am alav shanitak la'asay chashile. So we'll say, but here's what's interesting. The way classically we used that lo yuchal l'shalcha, right, or lo siya l'isha, ultimately is that in the event that he divorces her, he has to remarry her. So now back to the Brisa. So here we go. Desanya. Ones shegiresh. So right, Ruvain violated Rachel. And now what happens? He marries her. If so, the Gemara says, what happens if he then divorces her? Im Yisrael hu machzir ve'ein aloka. If he's Yisrael, he can remarry her and not get Makkos. Now both say, what does that mean? He can marry her and not get Makkos. So what does that seem to indicate? What is that? It's a lav hanitak la'aseh. Right? He's not allowed to divorce her, that's a lav, and then ultimately he remarries her. Vim koinu, that if he's a kohen, loke ve'ino machzir. If he's a kohen, obviously he can't remarry, because a kohen can't marry a divorcee, even his own divorcee, so he gets malchus. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Now, based on what we just said, in Yisrael, hu machzir ve'ino loke amai. But I don't understand. Now, both say, if you look at this as a lav hanitak la'aseh, then I understand why the Yisrael doesn't get malchus. He violated a lav, he divorced her, but then he remedied it by remarrying her. But I will say, but this is not a lav hanitak la'aseh. What should this be? This is a lo sa'aseh shekadmu aseh. Right? This is a prohibition that was preceded by a positive commandment. Well, Rabbi Yochanan, if you are right, then halacha l'maisa, there should be malchus for this. Yet the Brisa says that there are no Makkos for this. Lo saseh shekamu aseyu fililki. When Rabbi Yochanan saw this, he recanted. He figured his position was wrong. So we'll say, so just to show you the progression over here, Rabbi Yochanan espouses a position. Lav shekidnu aseh, or lo saseh shekidnu aseh. If you have a lo saseh, a prohibition, or a lav that is preceded by a positive commandment, you get Malchus for that. That is different than a lav hanitak la'aseh. Rabbi Yochanan, did you say it? Rabbi Yochanan says no. Why did Rabbi Yochanan retract? The case of Ones. Because he saw this case of Ones of Yisrael, right, who violated a woman, married her, and then divorced her. So the Brisa says he remarries her and doesn't get Malchus, which indicates to us that they're treating this as a lav hanitak la'aseh. Even though, again, structurally or textually, this is really an lo saseh shekidmu aseh. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you should get Malchus for that. The Brisa says you don't get Malchus for that. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what's Rabbi Yochanan's conclusion? I must be wrong. And therefore, again, he retracts. So now we're going to try to prove that Rabbi Yochanan is not wrong. Amr Ula, lo yomar lo. So Rabbi Ula says, now I'm going to tell you why this case is different. Listen to this. Lo yomar, lo siya li'isha ba'ones, v'ligmar mosi shemra. So the truth is, the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, the velo siya li'isha, which is the asay. That's the asay, right? Ultimately, again, lo siya li'isha, that she has to be his wife. He has to remain married to her. Right, because you're going to say, just to understand the structure of the pasuk, it says lo siya li'isha, velo siya li'isha, for him, for the violator, for Ruvain, she has to be his wife. Tachas hashena, because he violated her. Lo yuchal l'shalcha kol yimei chayov, right? Kol yamav, he cannot send her away. He can't divorce her. So you have the asay, lo siya li'isha, and lo yuchal l'shalcha, the lav. So Ulas, I'm going to tell you why this case is different. This lo siya li'isha, really by Ones, by the violator, is extraneous. Why? Ligmar Mosi Shemra. You can learn from Mosi Shemra. We'll say, who's Mosi Shemra? Mosi Shemra is a man who's married to a woman, right? Reuven married Rachel, and then after they got married, he claims that she was not a besula. She wasn't a besula. Now, if it turns out that ultimately, again, he's lying, so then the halacha is he has to pay a penalty. He has to pay a penalty, and he's not allowed to divorce her as well. So learn out Ones and Mosi Shemra. Ma Mosi Shemra shelo asa ma'isa menachman avlo siya li'isha. So I made Mosi Shemra where Ruvain, the husband, didn't do a ma'isa. But now, what does it mean he didn't do a ma'isa? It means, remember, what is he doing? It's speech. It's speech. He didn't do a ma'isa. Yet there is this penalty that he's never allowed to divorce her. Ones, the kol shekain, certainly by Ones where he did do a ma'isa, he certainly should not be allowed to divorce her as well. So the Gemara says, Lama ne'amar. So why? So therefore, again, the lo sia isha by ones is really extra. You don't need it. Learn it out from Motzi Shemra. But it's written. So if it's written, Eino inyan lefanav, tinei in la'acharav shim girei she'achzir. So use it to teach me that lo sia isha must be there not to tell us that the ones has to marry her, but rather what? That if the ones divorced her, if he divorced her, he has to remarry her. So essentially, it's reinforcing the asay after the lav, making it more into a lav hanitak la'asay, which is why the Brisa goes ahead and says, no Makkos. Okay, interesting approach. So the Gemara says, interesting approach. Va'akati onis motzi shemra lo gamer, but that's not true. You can't really learn out onis motzi shemra. Why not? Di'ika lemifrach, because we can raise a pircha. Mala motzi shemra shekin loke u'mishalim. Right? Rabbi say motzi shemra ultimately again both gets malchus. Right? Motzi shemra has three things. Number one, he can never divorce her. Number two, he gets malchus. Number three, there's a financial penalty. By ones, ultimately, again, there are no malchus. There's a financial penalty. You're never allowed to divorce her, but there are no malchus. So they're not similar. Elo, lo yomar lo sila isha motzi shemra, the ligmar me ones. Right? The Gemara says, okay, let's flip it. Don't say lo sila isha by motzi shemra, and instead learn it out by ones, right? And just say, just like an ones is not allowed to divorce his wife, right? So too a motzi shemra isn't allowed to divorce his wife, and say, uma ones she'ena loke mushalim umrachmanav lo sila isha, by ones, where you don't get malchus. You don't get malchus. Yet the Torah says the violator has to marry this woman. Motzi shemra, who does get malchus, lo kol shekain, ultimately has to marry her as well. Velama ne'amar. So therefore, I both say once again, why do I need the velo sia isha? Im eino inyan lemotzi shemra, tineo inyan laones. If you don't need it for motzi shemra, ultimately use it for ones. Furthermore, im eino inyan lefanav. And if you don't need it initially to tell me that he's obligated to marry her, use it to teach me that in the event that ones divorces his wife, he's obligated to remarry her. So I'll say it becomes an extra assay in the event that ones divorces his wife, in which case it's really reinforced as a lav hanitak la'aseh. If it's a lav hanitak la'aseh, everyone agrees there's no malchus, but it doesn't contradict Rabbi Yochanan's position, right? Because Rabbi Yochanan was all about Alo saseh shekid muaseh. Over here by onis, the presence of the extra aseh makes it into a lav hanitak la'aseh. Okay, so 1 second. Motzi shemra me onis nami lo gamer. It doesn't work. You can't learn out motzi shemra from onis. Why not? So the Gemara says, Di'ika lemifrach malo onis shekin asa maisa. Because we'll say, remember again, onis did a maisa. They're really not comparable, right? Onis is a maisa. Motzi shemra is not a maisa. Motzi shemra is just dibar. Ella. Lo yomar lo sieli isha b'motzi shemra shari ishtohi. So here's what's interesting. But here's the big difference also. By motzi shemra, I don't need that phrase lo sieli isha, right? Why? By motzi shemra, they're married. They're married already, right? I don't notice. By ones, I need velo sieli isha, but by motzi shemra, I don't need that phrase at all. Lama nemar. So why is it there? Why is velo sieli isha by motzi shemra? Now, eno in la motzi shemra, tnei in la ones. Now, ultimately, again, if I don't need it by motzi shemra, let me use it for ones. And if I don't need it to initially tell me that he has to marry, because that's already stated, use it to teach me that in the event that the ma'anes divorces his wife, he's obligated to marry her. Once again, what the Gemara is constantly doing is saying the following, that essentially by ones, there's going to be this extra assay. This extra assay, what does that extra assay do? The extra assay says that in the event that Reuven divorces Rachel, right? Reuven violated Rachel, married her. In the event that he divorced her, he has to remarry her. And it's an extra assay. That extra assay makes it into a lav hanitak la'aseh and not a lo saseh shekadmo aseh. Even though scripturally, textually, it's written as a lo saseh shekadmo aseh. And therefore, it makes sense that the Brisa says no malchus, and it doesn't contradict Rabbi Yochanan's original idea. But 1 second, maybe I don't understand why are you taking velo sieli isha by motzi shemra, giving it to ones. Keep it by motzi shemra and say like this. Tell us that by motzi shemra, the lo sieli isha makes it also lav hanitak la'aseh, and in the event that the motzi shemra divorced his wife and he remarries her, no malchus. Einach hinami. You're right. That is true. That is true. So the Gemara says, "Va'asi ones v'gamar minei," and ultimately, again, I can learn that ones from Motzi Shemra, and to say just like by Motzi Shemra, if he divorces his wife and then he remarries her, he avoids Makkos. So too, again, by ones, if he divorces his wife and remarries her, ultimately no Makkos. But again, here's the problem: the gamar minei. So now we want to learn out ones from Motzi Shemra. The Gemara says, here's the problem: my gamar minei. How are you learning out ones from Motzi Shemra? Iba kavachomer, if it's a kavachomer, so I'm sorry, Iba kavachomer, Ima Mansinu, Ikel Mifrach, Kidarachinon. So we'll say, so remember again, whether you're learning it out, whether you're learning out Onis or Motzi Shemra, either the kavachomer or a Mematsinu. Mematsinu is like a common denominator. Either way, the comparison is flawed. We'll say first wide line on Tesvav and Daleth. How is the comparison flawed? Malam Motzi Shemra, Shekin Lo Asa Maisa. We'll say, remember again, the comparison is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because the Maisa, again, Motzi Shemra is no Maisa. Right? There's no Maisa, it's just Dibor. Ones is a Maisa. It's very hard to justify a comparison between the two. Ela Amar Rava, rather we'll say Rava says, Kol Yomav Ba'omed V'Hachzer. So Rava says like this. Rava says like this. At the end of the day, so we'll say, take a look at a quick Rashi for just a moment, almost right across in Rashi to the right. Ela Amar Rava, Hadisanya Ba'onis Machzer Ve'ein Aloke. So we'll say, so remember again, we're just trying to figure out the following case. Ruvain is a Yisrael. He violates Rachel. He violates Rachel. So, right, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said, if he remarries her, he doesn't get Malkus. This is troubling for us. Why? Because Ones is a case of a lo saseh shekidmu aseh. Right? The way that it's framed is there's an aseh first, v'lo siya li'isha, she has to marry her, and then afterwards it says lo yuchal l'sholcha kol yemei chayav. She can't divorce her. In Rabbi Yochanan's model, that means there should be Malkus. The Bryce is telling us there are no Malkus. There are no Malkus. So we're spending all this time trying to. So Rabbi will say in a tremendous. I just want to point out in a tremendous display of humility. Rabbi Yochanan's reconciliation is, I'm wrong. I'm wrong. In a tremendous display of humility. The Gemara says, not so fast. Maybe you're not wrong. Maybe Ones is just a different kind of case that just doesn't fall in line with your model. Your model is correct. Ones is just an outlier. To which the Gemara says over here. So let's analyze this. So Rava comes along and says, you're right. I'll tell you why Ones is different. Rashi, Taima Mishum Dal Karchech, Lav Shinitak Laseh, Udo Amakra, Kol Yamav lo Havile, Kol Yamav, lo Havile Lemichtav, Ela lo Yuchal Shalcha, my Kol Yamav. So it comes along and says like this. So we'll say, by the Ones is very interesting. It says, Lo yuchal l'shalcha kol yamav. Kol yamav. Why do you need that? Just say, Lo yuchal l'shalcha. You can't divorce her. I understand. You can't divorce her when? As long as you live. I don't need that phrase, or those two words, kol yamav. Why is that here? Why is that here? So Rava wants to suggest that maybe Kol Yamav makes it different. Kol Yamav makes it a lav hanitak la'aseh. That's what Kol Yamav does. Kol Yamav says, Ruvain shouldn't have violated the woman in the first place. Understand it, right? Makes sense. Then if you did, you have to marry her, and you are not allowed to go ahead and divorce her. And if you divorce her, you have an obligation to remarry her. How long is that obligation devolve upon you? Kol Yamav. So it's a different kind of case. That Kol Yamav makes it a lav hanitak la'aseh. That says if you did divorce her, you have an obligation to remedy that. What is the window of remediation for this? The rest of your life. That makes it into a lav hanitak la'aseh. Beautiful. So Ela Amarav, back to the Gemara. Ela Amarav, Kol Yamav ba'amei v'hachzer. V'chein ki aser Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yamav ba'amod v'hachzer. So we'll say here it is. The Kol Yamav fundamentally changes the math on this, right? And the Kol Yamav says that halacha l'maisa, this is a lav hanitak la'aseh, even though structurally and textually it's a lo saseh shekidmu aseh. Rabbi Yochanan, this doesn't share anything. Kol Yamav makes it a lav hanitak la'aseh, and therefore again, Reuven, if he divorces Rachel, halacha l'maisa has an obligation to remarry her, and as long as he does remarry her, halacha l'maisa he avoids Malkus. Incredible. So I'm really Papa says Vahalo dummy lilave or lilave de lo chasima. Sorry. Ha lo dami lave lilav de chasima. Okay, suppose remember again 2 days ago we had this. What's the paradigmatic lav for Malkus purposes? The paradigmatic lav is lo sachsum. don't muzzle your animal. Right now, by the way, why is that the paradigmatic lav? Because it happens to appear right after the Torah discusses Makkos. Okay, so the Gemara says, 1 second, this lav is not comparable to the lav of lo chasima, right? Ultimately, again, right? Sheimbas, and I remember again, I just want to point out, the lo sachsam sharbadisha, that is the paradigmatic lav for Makkos. And I will say, why is that the paradigmatic lav for Makkos? Because there's no asay associated with it, right? So here you have a lav anitak la'aseh. So I don't understand if it's a lot. So how would one ever be subject to Makkos over here if this is not comparable to the lav of chasima? So Amar le mishum de kasabei rachmana aseh yisera migra gara. I don't understand because over here there's one additional asay, therefore it's going to make it worse. Gemara says, yeah, ihachi lav shenitak la'aseh nami le mishum de kasabei rachmana aseh yisera migra gara. But again, I will say using that logic, so lav hanitak la'aseh should also be subject to Makkos. Just because it has one additional asay, you should, right? It should make it worse. Amar le hahu lenatuke lafudasa. No, lav hanitak la'aseh is different. Why is it different? Because halacha l'maisa in a lav hanitak la'aseh, the asay is dafka coming to remove any the asay is there to clean up the lav and tell me that I'm not chayiv Makkos. I'm about to say, now watch this. This now leads to a fascinating idea, which we're going to talk about more tomorrow. Hani chalaman damar bitlo velo bitlo elaman da amar kaimo velo kaimo ma'ika lamemar. So we'll say, now watch this. Watch this. So we'll say, in general, when it comes to a lav and an aseh, right? Well, take a look at Rashi, the last Rashi in the daf, right? A little bit of a long Rashi. Here we go. Had amrit kol yom v'achzer kol yasiyaso lav shenitak laseh v'archavas lo zman lekiyam aseh kol yamav. So remember again, the way what Rava was suggesting was as follows. In the case of ones, the reason why there's no Makkos is because since it phrases the asay as kol yamav, it tells you again it's a lav hanitak la'aseh, and what's the window? What's the window for remediation? The rest of his life. So as long as Reuven is still alive, he's not going to get Makkos. Why? Because he has the ability to remedy the lav by remarrying her. Okay. Now Rashi goes on, Dvarecha, hadisanya machsir v'ina loka, liolam kamar, calls man shiyachol lomar, ani machsir, ein bezin malkinoso. So Rabbi says, now watch how this plays out. This is fascinating. Reuven violated Rachel. Sir. Right? Now penalty. Penalty, he has to marry her. Never allowed to divorce her. Okay? Marries her. Now he divorces her. So now, bring it to Beis Din. What does Beis Din do to Reuven? What do they do to him? What do they do to him? Nothing. They don't give him Makkos. Right? Why don't they give him Makkos? Why not? Why not? Because ultimately, again, he has a way to remedy it by remarrying her. What's the window for remediation? Kol Yamav. Which means something fascinating. Now, right now, Reuven is in violation because he divorced her. But since he has the ability to remedy it, effectively it becomes like a lav hanitak la'aseh, right? And therefore, again, it can't give him Makkos. Even though right now he is divorced, right? He is in violation, but since he can remedy this for the rest of his life, we don't give him Makkos. Okay, so now watch this. So the Gemara says, let's talk about that. Hani chalaman l'tani l'kamon, b'lav hanitak la'aseh, batal asaseh, chayiv alalav, lo bital asaseh pater. And what we're going to say is as follows. Okay, let me say this outside. There is a raging machlokes. The raging machlokes goes like this. If a person violates a lav, right? And now there is an asay that can remedy it. So do you get Makkos or not? So the Gemara says, it depends. If you hold bitlo, right, the bitlo, velo bitlo, which means as long as I did not negate the possibility of the performance of the asay, I don't get Makkos. Even though I haven't done the asay yet. As long as it is possible to do the asay, as long as I have not made it impossible to do the asay, then ultimately, again, I don't get Makkos, even though right now I haven't yet performed the asay. So let's give you an example over here. What would be an example? What would be an example of, let's say, again, Reuven violates Rachel, marries Rachel, and ultimately, again, now has the asay. Let's say he makes a neder, an irrevocable neder, that Rachel can't get benefit from him. That would be an example of where he is mevatel the asay. In that case, he would get Makkos. He would get Makkos. But as long as Reuven has not been mevatel the asay, he does not get Makkos. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought says, kaimo velo kaimo. No, it's not bittel. It's very simple. Reuven, you have an asay. Reuven, Are you remarrying her or you're not remarrying her? If you're not remarrying her right now, guess what? We're giving you Makkos. In other words, Lav Hanita Klase says, yeah, you have an assay to remedy the assay. You have an assay to remedy the los assay. And if you want to avoid Makkos, when must you exercise the assay? When? Now. And failure to do so gets you Makkos. So we'll say, right? I told you, I wasn't exactly. This is riveting. So we'll say, so again, now I have a Lav Hanita Klase. Everyone agrees that ultimately the assay cleans up the Lav. But when do you have to perform the assay in order to avoid Makkos for the los assay? So the first opinion that says bitlo v'lo bitlo means essentially, as long as you don't negate the possible performance of the assay, that will save you from Makkos. According to that, as long as Ruvain can remarry Rachel, even if he doesn't remarry Rachel, he doesn't get Makkos. According to the second school of thought that says kaimo v'lo kaimo says no. The only time the assay remedies the los assay is when you do it now. But if you don't do it now, we're going to give you Makkos. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Hani chalman damar bitlo v'lo bitlo. So Rava's statement of kol yamav ba'amud v'hachzer makes sense according to the opinion it's bitlo v'lo bitlo. So essentially, we're never going to give Reuven Makkos, because as long as Reuven has the ability to remarry Rachel, he's not going to get Makkos. But according to the opinion, it says, no. Lav Hanita Klase says, you have an assay that can remedy the lav. And as long as you do the assay right now, we won't give you Makkos. But if you don't do the assay right now, we're going to give you Makkos. So how does that shtim with Rava? So the Gemara says, Michael, I'm a base. Look at that. So the Gemara says, Midi hu taima el Rabbi Yochanan. Now remember again on both sides, this whole thing is only Rabbi Yochanan, right? Remember, this whole discussion is only for Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Ha'amar alei Rabbi Yochanan l'tana bitlo chayiv v'lo bitlo pater. Rabbi Yochanan both sides of the opinion of bitlo v'lo bitlo. The way Rabbi Yochanan understands Lav Hanita Klase ultimately is, after you do the Lav, as long as there is the possible performance of the assay. Possible performance, in other words, to say it differently, as long as you don't negate the possible performance of the assay, you are saved from Makkos. That's Rabbi Yochanan's position. The Gemara says, Tani Tani Kamed Rabbi Yochanan, because ultimately there's Rabbi Yochanan, Komitzos los assay, sheyesh ba komasay. So I'll say if you have a los assay that has an assay, which is what we call a lav hanitak la assay. So the Gemara says, Kiyem assay sheba potter. If you perform the assay after you did the los assay, you're potter from Makkos. Bitel assay sheba. If you negated the performance of the assay, in other words, if you made the assay impossible, then ultimately again you're going to be chayiv Makkos. I don't understand. What does that mean? My ka'amrit kiyem potter. Lo kiyem chayiv, bittel chayiv, lo bittel pot. We're talking about kiyem. Don't use that lashon. Use lashon of bittel. The Gemara says you're right. Tani bitlo v'lo bitlo. So I'll say ultimately again. Rabbi Yochanan says you're right. So I'll say this is so much converging over here now. I'll say this is a dramatically different understanding over here. So the way it works in Lav Hanita Klase, and I don't know, this is different I think than the intuitive way you understand it. How do you generally understand Lav Hanita Klase? I do an aver, I do a lav, and then what? And if I want to avoid Makkos, then what? Do the assay. When do you do the assay? When do you need to do it? When do you need, right? Now. And if you don't do it now, you're going to get Makkos. Rabbi Yochanan says that's not the way it works. The way Lav Hanita Klase works is like this. If you do the lav, as long as you have the possible performance of the assay, or to say it differently, as long as I have not negated the performance of the assay, right? Ultimately, that saves me from Makkos. So when do you do the assay? Whenever you get around to it. As long as I have not negated the performance of the assay, I'm saved from Makkos. This is what we call bitlo, below bitlo. That's the shita of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Shmuel Silber disagrees. So now we're kind of taking a little break from remember, we still have Rabbi Yochanan's shita dangling out there, right? Rabbi Yochanan's idea of kol lo saseh shekidmu aseh, you get Makkos. Right, so I have a lav hanita klase, which I'm not going to get Makkos for. Lo saseh shekidmu aseh, which comes from Rabbi Yochanan, I'm going to get Makkos for. Now, in lav hanita klase, originally machlokes Rabbi Yochanan, what does Rish Lakish say? Rabbi Shimon Lakish Omer, kaimo v'lo kaimo. Rish Lakish says no. The way it works in a lav hanita klase, is when will you avoid Makkos? When you actually do the assay. But if you don't immediately do the assay, you are going to get Makkos. The Gemara says, "Amai kamiflagi." What are they arguing about? Okay, but say this is about to get. You thought it couldn't get more exciting. Watch this. Makamiflagi, basras safek kamiflagi. Ooh, wow. Okay. So let's at least mention this, although we're not going to finish it today. So what are they arguing about? Hasras Safek. Hasras Safek. So we'll say, you know what, so pause here for just a second. So let's just get down what we have over here, right? So far, again, in our Makkos world, what we've got, number one, is I'm going to get Makkos for a lav, stam a lav, just a regular lav. I'm going to get Makkos for chavi krisos, right? I'm not going to get lav for a lav hanitak la'aseh. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, again, introducing to us a new model over here, I'm going to get Makkos for a lo sa'aseh, shekidmu aseh. Rabbi Yochanan recanted because he thought the case of Ones contradicted him. Rava comes along and says, Ones is not contradicting you. Ones is coming along and Ones is different. Why? Two words. What are the two words? Kol Yamav. Kol Yamav. Kol Yamav says that essentially the window for performance of the aseh is all of his days. The Gemara says that shtims great if you hold that the mechanics of lav anitak la'aseh are bitlo velo bitlo. But if you say that it's kaimo velo kaimo, then why should that work? No problem. Rabbi Yochanan holds bitlo velo bitlo. And now introduced to the machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, how does lav hanitak la'aseh work? Rabbi Yochanan bitlo velo bitlo, Reish Lakish kaimo velo kaimo. The explanation of the machlokes and halacha l'maisa, Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Shkayach habosai. All right, Chavran Zum, have a great day, everyone.